We're going to talk about college admissions today. And my guest is the revered, I don't know what words to put in front of your name, Susan. I'm going to embarrass you if I do it. So my friend, Susan Tree, I'll just do that. And I just wanted to, and I know that you're not going to like doing this, but I wanted you to could you just take a minute, Susan, to just give folks a little bit about your background and, your experience in the admissions world so that folks have a little bit of context?
Sure. No, I'd be happy to. And hi, everybody. I'm really delighted to spend some time with you. For me, it's evening. For you, it may be morning. And wherever we are, we're all in this together at this moment. So cheers to that. My name is Susan Tree. I've been in the college admissions profession since the 1980s, more or less, and have seen the profession go through a lot of changes. I worked for the first half of my career at a small liberal arts college in New England, Bates College in Maine, which I had the pleasure of working for them at the time that they decided to experiment with being test optional in the admissions process. And I was part of that statistical research that both took place and then validated the decision. No one else was doing it at that time, except for a few places that had done it mostly for public relations reasons, but we wanted to start accumulating a statistical profile that other colleges could also benefit from in terms of the research that could convince the faculty and then show in a longitudinal way over the decades that followed that good admissions decisions could be made in the absence of standardized test scores, and that for any institution interested in diversity and access, and this was a while ago before these were kind of buzz phrases, Ethan, as you know, but that the results were astronomically successful for the institution and for young people who then were able to enroll. So I was a native New Yorker, grew up in Manhattan, Quaker school grad, and loved living in Maine. Did my graduate work in school counseling at the University of Southern Maine while I was working at the college, and decided that what I really wanted to do was be in the trenches with kids and parents. So finished my degree, took a position as director of college counseling at the granddaddy of all Quaker schools. Hats off to Westtown School in Westchester, Pennsylvania, an international boarding and day school, and had the pleasure of working there with kids from around the United States and the world, from tremendous commitment to multiculturalism, and was able to become very active in the admissions profession at that point, and really thoroughly enjoyed all of that for a couple of decades, and continued to be an advocate for standardized testing, taking excuse my dog, a very limited role in the admissions process. And so here we are now. I have the pleasure of being a college counselor and supporting kids and families that are in the college essay guy family, and really taking part in now a national conversation around what it means to be your best self in the admissions process, and speak your truth in a powerful and authentic way through the applications, and now the national conversation around what are we going to do about standardized testing moving forward, Ethan? Yeah. That's taking up a lot of my pandemic landscape.
Let's get into it. So thank you. Thanks for that context. For the folks at home, the quick bullet points of what we're going to cover. We're going to talk about just initially, what are some of the things that have changed since the pandemic started? And then I also want, Susan, I want you to share, what are some of the things that are the same? What are the things that really haven't changed for folks? And then we're going to get into a little bit of, there's sometimes a tendency for students to think of this as a race of grades and test scores, and there are other options. I want to get into, why students are sometimes, really well qualified students who have great grades. If they do tests, great test scores, extracurriculars, awesome essays, all the things, still don't get into great schools. Why does that happen? And then we want to make sure that we've got lots of time for questions. So we'll spend the first 20, 25 minutes or so, Susan and I here jamming on some of the things that we promise we deliver. I'll be sort of, in between going, oh, here's a link to this, and here's a link to this. And at the end, we're going to follow up with, when we send you the email, we're going to follow up with lots of resources. So you'll have all the practical. So this is, broadly speaking, what should we be doing right now? But we also want to set context for why should we be doing some of these things. So let's start with the first question. What do you feel like, Susan, has changed and what hasn't changed based on the pandemic over the past year?
Well, I think what the pandemic has done is it has exposed parts of the college admission process. It has exposed changes that really have been going along for the last 20, 30 years in small measure. That when the echo of the baby boom passed through the college admission process, and this was when we had the enormous baby boom following World War II. Those folks are now elderly, and their grandkids and the next generation are in this. But when their children moved through the college admission process, there was this echo, and there was a tremendous. I'm now putting on my headphones, so the barking dog is not going to be part of our.
I mean, I think we'll still hear Puppy in the background. It's fine. This will be a dog-friendly webinar.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So applicant pools in the 70s and the 80s declined a lot, especially in the nation's industrial states. And I was in admissions at that time in New England, and that's when a lot of colleges burst onto the national scene in terms of recruiting, because they saw that the population in the mid-Atlantic and New England was going to be dwindling tremendously. So a lot of colleges started using student search, which is how you get that unsolicited mail after you take the PSAT and the SATs. They started reaching out and recruiting in a much less personal but national scattershot way to beef up their inquiry pools so they could work hard at turning more of those young people into applicants and have greater selectivity when they then admitted them and could shape their classes more in a more thoughtful and intentional way. So I'm not sure after that big decline, we knew we were actually going to be coming back as strong as we have as a population size in this country. I read a statistic just recently where the number of students in higher ed in the last 30 years has increased by over 60%. That it's a very, very much larger population of Americans in higher ed, not all of whom are traditional as we think of them, dating back to when a lot of us were in college or our parents were in college. But yet the size of colleges, public and private, has increased very little. I think it's less than 20%. So this pressure, even though for a while it looked like the population was going down, there was this explosion of people motivated to pursue higher ed and a shrinking, what seemed to be fewer spaces available. So what the pandemic did is, Ethan, is it accelerated a lot of these things that had been slow-moving trends over the last couple decades. In the 90s, we saw an enormous increase in selectivity at the more competitive colleges because they were recruiting so much more. They discovered this phenomenon called recruit to reject, thanks to U.S. News and World Report, which was emphasizing in their ratings, emphasizing the yield, the small admit percentage, and the very high yield of admitted students who then were enrolling. And those colleges were climbing the rankings chart very quickly. And colleges learned that they could hire professionals to come in as enrollment managers and create larger applicant pools so they could shape their classes more intentionally, but also turn down a lot more kids. So starting around 2000 and into this century, which is now 20 years old, we saw a lot more well-qualified kids not feeling like they had the choices that their parents had. Parents were very slow to adjust their sights. They didn't understand why their generation had gotten into a lot of these highly competitive schools, and the kids' generation was not. So some of this accelerated tremendously during the pandemic because of some other forces of nature that came in, one of which was a disruption in schooling. Kids had more time last fall. The kids that are graduating now, when they were in their, starting their college research, they suddenly had a lot more time on their hands, and they could apply to a lot more colleges. And they found out you could apply up to 20 on the Common App, and and that was not as much of a phenomenon.
Right.
Also, the removal, the separation of standardized test scores from the process opened the floodgates to kids who did not perceive that they had access. Now, that was for a few reasons. The good news in that is we saw a large increase in underrepresented kids suddenly applying to a larger number of colleges, maybe not just their regional public university, which was more in line with what had been done in previous generations, but because they had strong grades and excellent credentials and they were leaders and shapers and movers and shakers, they decided to throw their hat in the ring because their self-perceived lower test scores were no longer going to be a shut the door in their face. A good thing. We saw increases there. But what we really saw were an increase in the number of applications being submitted per student.
In fact,
was a big change.
I've got your numbers here. I'm going to quote your numbers because I've got them on my screen here. 11% overall, more applications to, via the Common App, 12% overall more in public, largest increases at the most selective institutions, and then 20 to 24% historically underrepresented populations.
Yeah.
Amazing. 46% self-reported test scores. Last year was 77. So some big things. And then I imagine too, there were some things that, or what would you say in terms of even the process of applying, like what stayed the same? Like what was relatively similar? Because for somebody who's like, oh, it's all changed, everything's on its head. Well, that's not necessarily true, right? Because some things are still the same, right? Students are still submitting applications. They still need to submit their activities list. They still need to write the essays. Certainly there's like the COVID section that was different this year, which we'll get into in just a few minutes. But were there, what is your sense of like, well, in some ways, it was a process like past years? Like in what sense was that true, do you think?
Well, colleges had to rethink their now, I'm saying colleges had to rethink how they were going to evaluate applications. There had been a steady transition toward holistic evaluation, toward finding a way, especially with the huge number of schools that had voluntarily gone test optional in the last period of time. I mean, beginning the 10, 20 years ago, it was mostly small liberal arts colleges who felt they had the resources to make good admissions decisions in the absence of test scores. And then when research universities and some public universities started saying it's really our commitment to equity and access is going to lead us in this direction, and we will figure out how to evaluate applications. I watched Wake Forest University and Temple University, University of Rochester, and then just recently University of Chicago, big time research universities, not just the small, let's look at the whole child liberal arts college. These are major players in the national research world. So there was a lot of momentum there. And what these colleges found over the last decade or two is going test optional proved that the test scores really weren't helping them predict who would be a success or a failure at their school.
Right.
And I'll make this statement right now. This is where I disagree with a couple of people that are getting a lot of media attention right now, that colleges, if they go back to requiring test scores, and I know there's some big names on the fence that are evaluating, they're going to have to prove that the test scores, they need the test scores to help them make better admissions decisions, that it's not a matter of convenience.
That's a great point.
I feel very, very strongly, and they're going to have to prove that equity and access will not be threatened when they go back. And truthfully, Ethan, I think that is going to be impossible.
Yeah.
That no college in its right mind is going to do that. The faculty won't let them, because the faculty are thrilled to pieces. They haven't recognized it quite yet, that they will. They're going to starting next fall. They're going to love the voices in their classrooms. And that's what all of the rest of the colleges found out years ago when they started laying down. Now, what's happening though is colleges are having to redefine what holistic admission means, right? Because that is harder. We have a whole generation of kids who didn't have grades for their junior year coming up. Right? A lot of them didn't, or they had kind of a do no harm grading policy.
Right.
And they're not, some of them aren't going to have test scores. Their teachers might not know them as well. So there's a phrase coming out now called evidence-based holistic admissions, where colleges are going to get clearer, and hopefully clearer with the public and not just with their evaluators, but clearer about what that means for the kids who are moving into this process, so that students can begin to recognize what these new credentials might look like in the coming years to bring forward their case.
Yeah. So let's get into the practical then. In terms of what can students do? So like in some cases, more students are applying to more schools, acceptance rates are dropping. What can students do? And when we were prepping for this, you said, students need to stop thinking of the admissions process as a contest of grades and scores. What can they do? What are some specific things that students who are listening to this, or counselors who are advising students, can advise students to do, given that things are potentially becoming more competitive?
Well, and who are they becoming more competitive for? Not for everybody, right? So if you think about college admissions as a way that the admissions office is held responsible for bringing into the institution the students who will obviously thrive, but a lot of kids will thrive at a college, right? But who will meet what the institution wants. And every institution has institutional goals that serve as the framework for both the teaching, the academic program, and the people who deliver it, and the learning, and the students who are being educated in that environment. But to that end, colleges and universities are organisms. They're living, breathing, functioning organisms. They have alumni. They have state governments that in many cases are handing down a lot of policy and guidance. They have historical, mission-driven priorities. Almost every college in this country, kids tend to ignore those, but those are the soil in which the institution is planted, and it reinterprets itself continually. They have sports teams. They have other competitive dimensions that earn them public acclaim, media attention, money, for TV rights. And so colleges have to, the admissions office has to please a lot of people. So the buckets that they have to fill, and I just named a lot of examples of those buckets, those haven't changed. Now we've also got the equity and access bucket. We've got the first generation bucket, whatever it is that college has decided floats its boat, that's what they want to do. Those buckets still have to be filled. So where is the competition really being felt? And colleges refer to this as selection pressure because they don't like to call it competition, which I totally respect. Selection pressure is this squeeze that's felt by applicants. The kids that feel it the most are the ones that don't go into a bucket. They're not meeting a particular institutional need, or they haven't expressed themselves in a way in their application that allows the admissions people to connect them to a particular, some of these are open, they're public. These priorities, recruitment priorities, are transparent. Some of them are extremely private. They're very secret. So you could say to a college admissions counselor, could you tell me what some of your recruitment priorities are for the coming year? And as a college counselor, I did that all the time. Then when my students left the room, if this was a presentation at my high school, when my students left the room, I would say, can you share any additional recruitment priorities that you might not have been comfortable sharing in front of students? And sometimes I'd get a few more.
And so
the kids.
What do students do with that? So if I'm a student listening to this and I'm like, the schools have these buckets, what can I do in that situation? How do I then move through this process?
Okay, well, my advice is, what you don't do is do what I call scattershot applications. What you do is you really tailor an application to an institution insofar as that's possible. And one of the first things I say to students is, you read the mission statement, you read about the history of the university or the college. Who founded them? The college I worked for and recruited for was founded by abolitionists. Okay, the language they used to describe themselves and their academic program and our recruiting literature had a great deal to do with egalitarian learning, social justice. So when we read applications and a student used our language to describe themselves and provide a context for why being in that educational environment appealed to them, it made an enormous difference. This takes a degree of research on the part of a student that will do them a lot of good, truthfully, because maybe it's, you're a big fan of the history of Western civilization and you love Columbia University's academic core. Whether you're an English major or a chemistry major, you share this common language around the history and the development of civilization. That's a core curriculum. There'd be no way you would apply at the same time to a school with an open curriculum that never had a word about any of those particular institutional values.
Right.
So learn to speak the language that the college uses to describe itself and the kinds of students that it's hoping to gather into its classrooms. Then you're the kind of student that the faculty really want to teach. Now, you also need to read about their admission process, because colleges are becoming more transparent on their admissions websites about what they mean as holistic admission, holistic evaluation. And that should inform every applicant's approach to that admissions process. Absolutely. Because you know what? They're telling you what they're looking for.
Right.
They're putting it in print on the website. And if you don't write your application, or at least the part of the application that you have control over, in response to that, they're not going to see it. You're not going to get points when they go through. I mean, a great example, and I'll give you a wonderful example, is Johns Hopkins University has on their admissions website the 3 categories of investigation when they read an application. And they show why it's evidence-based. So they're laying it right out there, and they're hoping that an applicant will bring their experience to those 3 points of emphasis.
And one of the things that we'll share in the follow-up to this is, like, as you students are developing your college list and you're looking to develop your list and figure out how do you research it, we're going to share a resource that'll help you sort through, all the many colleges that are out there. This is a resource that Susan helped write. And so for those students who are thinking back on their past year and they're going, yes, that sounds great to show these different sides of myself, but I haven't had much, for example, extracurricular involvement.
Right.
I've been mostly stuck at home with my family and my dog. Like, how do I stand out, with limited opportunities, especially in the last year, or by the time they apply, 1.5 years or almost 2 years? Like, what do you say to those students? Like,
well, you are so much more than a resume. And one of the big misperceptions misunderstandings about the admissions process, Ethan, is that, my 4.0 and my 10 AP classes and my resume of leadership and great stuff, activities, contributions, service, is the golden ticket. Mm-hmm. And you know what? It gets you as an applicant through the first cut. It does. Colleges respect what went into earning those grades and taking those courses and doing those activities. But that only eliminates a percentage of the kids who apply. Then you have to face the second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth cuts. Where everything.
We're talking about, and by the way, we're talking about highly selective schools, right?
Right.
Right.
Right, but that's what is it? The average acceptance percentage by a university in this country is 65%, I think.
60%, yeah. Awesome. So, you checked me earlier and I'm checking you. So the thing that Susan and I are harping on here is like most schools, I'll put it this way, most schools accept most students.
That's right.
And when I was talking earlier about, well, schools have become more competitive. Well, the point that you made is that they become competitive for some students at some schools, at a very small percentage of schools. But there are so many schools. And one of the things in the resource that we'll share is like, there's so many awesome schools out there that want you and that will recognize the awesomeness of all the things that you've done. And we'll be like, come here and we'll give you $12,000 or $34,000 or whatever it is. So what I think what you're talking about right now is like, in terms of that first gate, if we're talking about those highly selective schools, it gets harder and harder in some cases, or as Akil says, highly rejective schools, right? That when we're talking about those schools, yeah. So then I like this point that you're making though, is the student is more than just a resume and more than just there. And I'd love for you to give if you have an example of something that you read over, I don't know if it was, however long ago, but in terms of something that you read that you're like, here's something or here are a couple of examples of students who really stood out. And then it wasn't about their grades or their, test scores or anything like that.
And that's really an important point, because the intent, it's not so much tangibles versus intangibles in an application. It's really evidence on the part of the student that they have intellectual curiosity, that they care deeply about things that they love to study and do, that they're beginning as teenagers to understand they have a contribution to make, whether it's in the home to the family unit. We've seen a lot of, cross-generational experience during the pandemic where the older teenagers in the family have had to totally step into a space, either with their grandparents or their siblings, where they've simply had to assume responsibility at a level that maybe they had just dabbled in, but that they weren't expected to. Some were expected to stop extracurriculars and start working to contribute to the finances of a family. And the impact on a young person's maturity and self-awareness is profound. And there should never be embarrassment or fear of being judged because there was a shift in the priorities of a family. This is something we will be seeing in young people's essays for years to come.
Right.
I hope we'll never go back to admissions being kind of a contest of, how many APs I took, but also how many clubs I joined, how many, presidencies I held. And I think the call to depth and meaning is greater now, and has been recognized by colleges in a way that needs to be valued and have tremendous. I think it's always been valued, Ethan, but it has never risen up in applications like it did this year, where a lot of stuff was stripped away from kids applying to colleges this year, and they had to tell very different stories. And it wasn't necessarily resume glossy stories. These were deeply meaningful stories of having to make choices about how they were going to spend their time and what they learned. what they learned, the meaning they found, and the maturity they gained, and the lack of regret because of the takeaway for them of feeling like they helped, whether it was their family get through the pandemic, or their community, or some elderly neighbor. These are real stories by these. This is the takeaway for this generation of young people that I think is going to be that's going to be stunning for time to come.
Yeah, it's interesting to wonder for how long there will be that Common App question. So for those who aren't aware, this past year, the Common App, which is the platform that many students use to apply to many private schools, and that you, rising juniors or sophomores or freshmen, might use someday. But they added this question that was 250 word space of discussing how was your life impacted by the pandemic. And one of the things, and I want to hear some of what did you see this year, but some of the things I saw from students were students who'd gone through extraordinary challenges. And, one student that I worked with out of Tucson, her family, in terms of their income was impacted a huge way. And just to give a little practical side note thing, and again, we'll share a follow-up resource with this, but it's like describing the challenge and how it impacted you, and then what you did about it and what you learned. You can do that in 250 words if you're straightforward and factual, and that is definitely the place for that. And for those students who are listening and going, well, I didn't really face challenges, but I did learn some stuff, or I did some stuff, then another resource that we'll link to is like thinking about what are those couple values that you connected with. What did you spend your time doing? Was it connecting with family more deeply? Did you focus more on your health or nutrition? Was it, you had some free time to read? Maybe you started to read, you read a book series. So what are those 2 or 3 things? And could you just give us a little sense, a glimpse into what your world looked like? I saw students do that in some really wonderful ways. I'd be curious if there's anything that stuck out for you in terms of specific things that you saw about the way students use that particular section. Because what I loved about that, sorry, one more quick note, is that I love that students would then use their personal statements to write about all kinds of different things, different chapters in their lives, and then really use that pandemic section to write about that. But what did you notice or see? Anything specific pop up for you?
Well, and I've had the pleasure of being an application reader for a research university for the last couple of years, and what I've learned in this year more than ever is that less is more. That when students focus in their writing on something and they go deep with it, when they challenge assumptions maybe that they had before they had an experience, when they were forced to question some of their values, because really what the application is, it's a historical document looking back at, teenager, your lifetime of learning to date. It's kind of that history. It's the present. It's the who are you now? What have you come as a 16, 17, 18-year-old? What have you come, to, we hold these truths to be self-evident. What's your answer to that, teenager? What have you discovered to be true and important and real? And what do you recognize about yourself? About your talents and your power. Where are you experiencing your power to affect change? And everybody has that differently. Some in teeny little ways, and some in big ways. But it's all deeply rooted in that past and present. Then the colleges are trying to figure out the future. So what they want to hear in your application is, who are you becoming? Mm-hmm. Who is the adult that you want to be in the world? So the application process needs to take that internal view of self-image and identity, which is the job. All of us who were psych majors, in college, and there are a lot of us educators out there that majored in psych. Mm-hmm. What we know about the teenager's job is identity formation. Right. It's that acknowledgement of self. And what does that look like as you begin to separate from your parents a little bit and mm-hmm. move into an autonomous identity? But then as you look ahead, what kind of adult do you want to be in the world? Because that's the person that's going to be on that college campus. Mm-hmm. What talents are you bringing? What strengths? What weaknesses? What vulnerabilities? How are you going to influence your peers? How are you going to be an influence in the classroom when suddenly you're in potentially a much more diverse socio-political place where people are going to have to listen and be challenged and grow and give and take? And so think of that application, especially those of you that are juniors. Sit down and do a draft of a common application. Right now, you can go on to the Common App, make yourself an account. It's the application that the seniors used this year, but you can make an account. Say you're a junior, say you're a sophomore. It'll turn into your application around the middle of the summer, around August 1st, when the Common App releases its new iteration. And the work that you've done on it will still be there, as long as you say, please, you have to respond and say, yes, keep my stuff. But start looking at this through the eyes of how they're going to be, how the college readers are going to look at your application. And remember, they're looking past, they're looking at what influences, what cultures, what experiences shaped your young life, influenced you. Who are you right now as you're thinking about applying to college? What's your sense of self, of power, of promise? And who are you becoming? Who are you going to be, not just on our campus, although that's step one, but who are you going to be in the world? What do you want to change? What do you want to do? How are you, if you're going to be an influencer, how are you going to influence? And right. we all are influencers. So the best thing you can do is start looking at the pieces of the application, juniors, like a jigsaw puzzle, that you are pulling together to create a clear and coherent picture. But so juniors, what the picture looks like, just like, and I pull out my jigsaw box right here on my table, except my ring light is on top of it, so I can't. But I have a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle right here. I look at the box top and I go, oh, that's what it's going to look like when it's all done. No one knows what you're going to look like when you're all done. You're not even going to be all done in college. You've got a lifetime of learning and growing to do. But you know what you look like now. You have to design the pieces of your application just like you would of the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, so that the admissions people can begin to see the picture take shape and have meaning in front of them. So it's every piece in that puzzle that you submit as part of your application needs to have meaning and enlarge and enliven that application so that you're not common. So Ethan and I we're joking about, you can fill out a common application, but you can't be a common applicant. You've got to the goal is not to look like everybody else. Right? The goal is that you come out of this with an application that really looks, sounds, and feels like you, so that you don't look like a lot of other applicants, even though you may have the same grades and have taken similar courses, but that your application speaks to your past, your present, and the person that you are becoming. There's a lot of control in that for the juniors, but you got to put yourself have an out-of-body experience, step over to the other side of pretending you're the admissions counselor and look at your life, your stuff, and have some control, figure out how you're going to put it together, just like the chapters, find the metaphor that works for you. Right. I like the jigsaw puzzle.
I like that one too. So I want to get to some folks' questions, because folks have lots of awesome questions. And before we do that, I just want to share with folks, these are some of the resources that we're going to follow up with. This is our college application hub, which has a couple of the resources that we've mentioned already. And if you look at this one at the top, it'll be the short answer to the question of what should you be doing right now if you're a junior working on your college list. I think it's a little bit early maybe to start thinking about essays. I mean, don't worry, there are other webinars coming soon where we'll get into some of the stuff that Susan's talking about here in terms of like you're hearing Susan say, you need to think about the application. Okay, well, how do you do that? How do you figure out what those pieces are? That's something that we're going to follow up with in a few weeks. There's a webinar coming up with Ted Fisk, who wrote the book, literally, or who's helped put together the book for the Fisk Guide and researching colleges. So we'll have more on that soon. But here, if you want to get started on developing your college list, that's a great thing to be doing right now. And then if you click here, you'll see a college application and admissions timeline. So this is sort of the steps, and it's broken down by 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade. I know folks are asking, where do I get this? You'll get the link, don't worry. In fact, actually, if you wouldn't mind, you can just throw the link in right now. Thank you. And then for those of you who are like, it would be great to research, but I can't visit a campus because they're not opening the campus and they don't want to see me yet. Here's a research on how to research colleges without visiting a campus. If you're thinking about maybe applying early decision or early action, we've got a whole guide on that to sort of think through some of that. When it comes time, and it still feels like a little bit early, but if you're kind of eager to get started on essays, we've got a bunch of exercises in here. And again, stay tuned because there will be separate webinars on that. Some of the things that we talked about in terms of COVID-19, coronavirus, this will be found in here. Some of that tactical stuff that I was talking about when it comes to kind of filling out your application and thinking about how do you talk about the pandemic impact on your life. That'll be in here. There's more stuff on essays, and I'm not going to go through all of these resources, but as you'll see, some counselors are looking at this for the first time being like, I should maybe bookmark this. This is the one that I have bookmarked and the one that I share most frequently because it's basically of the 200 and some blog posts we have. These are sort of some of our top favorites, and they have supplemental essays, which juniors, you don't need to worry about just yet because many of the schools haven't released their essays. But it's got some guidance on activities lists, additional information. Here's another thing that you can start thinking about is recommendation letters. Like, what are those? Who are those teachers? And can you reach out to your counselor and start to get a recommendation letter and say, hey, before you forget me, before you go off for the summer, because what's going to happen is everybody else is not going to ask for a recommendation letter, and you're going to come back, and you and 200 of your classmates are going to be like, hey, you specific teacher, can you write me a recommendation letter? They're going to be totally overwhelmed, and they're going to be like, who are you again? So now is a good time to start. And there's a little guide here about how to ask for a recommendation letter. Side note, there's a guide for teachers and counselors on writing recommendation letters. Interviews, you don't have to worry about until way later. But essentially, right here, it maps through pretty much all the things that you'll need, even after you apply. We haven't really touched on it deeply. We talked about it with Tom last week in the webinar, but what is demonstrated interest and how do you demonstrate it in a pandemic? We talk about that a little bit. And then if you identify as an athlete or LGBTQ student or low income, first gen, if you're interested in women's colleges or undocumented student, you've got lots of stuff here. So that's, I know, super overwhelming for folks. And it's like, what did he just say? But it's pretty much, and we'll share that link that folks can, look through at your leisure. Okay, I have the difficult job of choosing from some of these questions, but I'm going to pick one that jumped out here. And this is one that comes up quite a bit. And I think especially in terms of the pandemic, but one person asks, and what is your take on this? I know this one we could go on for just 10 minutes on this one. So I'm going to ask you to see if we can, so that we can get to a few more questions, see if you can keep a shortish answer to this one. But is discussing mental health on a college essay recommended?
That's an outstanding question. I think that as an applicant, you need to sit down at some point with your transcript in front of you. You can get a transcript from, your guidance counselor at school. And you have to say aside from just the grades in certain classes, are there any trends or are there any marking periods where there's something that's going to raise a question in the mind of the reader? And when I have read applications, I have always felt strongly about valuing students' honesty and their own insightfulness about their journey. If grades were impacted or if there was a circumstance where something went wrong. Tell me the question again, Ethan, before I go off on a tangent.
No, that's okay. Is discussing mental health on a college essay recommended?
So, first of all, always find a trusted mentor for the parts of your application that are more subjective or that are explanatory. I think it's whether it's a teacher or probably not a relative, maybe, depends. But, whether you have a counselor or a friend who's in education, it's always good that as you write about something, you get some feedback on it to see how it's coming across. There's a big difference between providing an explanation and making excuses. Mm-hmm. And both are appropriate at different times in our lives. But when you're providing rationale in an application for why maybe grades at a particular time in your life weren't consistent with other grades, a blip on the radar screen, it's really important to write that from your heart, get some feedback on it. And colleges will want to know about that. I mean, they're human beings reading your applications on the other end. And if there's something that's inconsistent in your record, that it probably behooves you to provide the rationale. But again, the difference between excuses and reasons are heartfelt, they're contextual, they're sharing so that the person who's looking at your information can understand what was going on in your life. And, I hate to say it this way, but what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. And I've worked with so many students over the years, both on the college admissions side and then as a high school college counselor, where it was those moments of hard lessons learned through circumstances, family, individual, that were the makings of that student's character. And for them to talk about it with an adult, find an approach to share the information and to be honest about that in an application, I think can be extremely contextual and provide a very positive response. But there's some things that works for, and maybe some things that you need a little feedback from an adult.
Yeah. You're making such an important point here. One resource that I want to point to the person asking this question, there's an exercise shared on that hub called the Feelings and Needs exercise. And it's a good one for, and this is true for whether it's been a mental health challenge or other challenges, it's a good one for determining if there's something there and that might turn into a good essay. And the point I think here that Susan's making is like talking to a counselor or a trusted mentor about whether that's personal statement appropriate, or if it's something that should go in the additional information section with a little note of like, hey, here's a thing that I experienced, but it doesn't define who I am. Here, again, challenges what I did about it, what I learned through the experience. And then you've got your full college essay to potentially talk about it. I think the problem sometimes is students go, should I write about this or not? And it's a false dichotomy. It's like, well, rather than think about, should I write about this or not? The other thing you can do, and we'll talk about this in a few weeks, by brainstorming a whole bunch of ideas and having this mental health challenge as one of those ideas, I want you to have 10 or 12 ideas.
Right.
And then you get to go, of all these, it's not just like, do I write about this one thing or not? That might be the thing that's looming largest, or maybe lately that's looming largest, but you've got all these other sides of you. So I want you to brainstorm one of these other sides and then see if that thing ends up being the one that rises to the top as your biggest story. Another one just came in. This is a doozy. So I don't know how I would answer this. So I'm going to throw it to you. With more students, there are two questions and they're related, so I'm going to ask them both. Stacy asks, with more students applying to schools, do students need to reassess what is a target, reach, and likely school? And related to that, in terms of testing, how do you do a genuine college search without SAT scores?
Ask the first question again.
All right, I'll ask you one question at a time. My bad.
Well, let's break those up.
with more students applying to schools, do students need to reassess what is a target, reach, and likely school?
Well, absolutely. I think this is I think it's truthfully very hard for students to ever make an assessment correctly on that, because they may not know the history of the classmates who preceded them at their school. If you have a guidance counselor who keeps careful track of these things and has good history with different colleges, there's more predictability on that that side. But if as a high schooler, all you're doing is comparing your stats to what the published stats are of a school, it's very hard to predict because most admission is holistic. There's some element of holistic review involved in the application. But drill down in that one and tell me what the real question is.
There's so many questions, by the way, that are coming in terms of when writing an essay, how do you make yourself stand out? And, you know, how do we are unique in our writing? And I just want everybody that's watching to know that all of the essay stuff we're going to cover, the reason we're not covering it on this webinar is we feel like there's some other things to be thinking about and to be working on. Part of that is the college list right now. And then just know that when the time is right, which is for us, we feel like it's sort of, you know, start of the summer, we're going to have all the essay webinars that you can handle. So all the essay related questions. So that's why I'm not covering them in too much depth, with the exception of the one I just asked right now. Okay, here's one from Joe. With this test optional, you know, movement, these policies, how important is the high school profile in the admissions process? Will past high school graduates' performance in college affect the chance of incoming college applicants to be accepted? Crystal ball moment. You know, this is an interesting one. So because things are so up in the air, like how much is it going to matter? It's probably hard to answer this, but how much is it going to matter how past students have done if we're not looking at test scores anymore? It's probably a hard one to answer.
Well, most admissions offices do keep historical records on the application history from different high schools. When I was in admissions, we were fastidious about that. We used that kind of data very carefully. I have found in recent years that colleges feel to me like they're paying less attention to the history with a particular high school. That's not really rephrase that question for me, Ethan.
Yeah, so essentially, it seems like a lot of that historical data on colleges, or sorry, from high schools, is based on, you know, here's the student profile based on our testing. You know, I guess the curiosity here is like, how relevant is that going to be if we sort of take away the testing component? Like, is that still going to be useful information if then suddenly students aren't applying with test scores?
Can you hear my dog barking?
It's okay.
I'm sorry, friends.
No, it's totally fine. Imagine that we're in the living room together and we've got remind me what your dog's name is, by the way?
I'm looking to see which one it is. It's Sadie.
It's Sadie. Sadie, we love you.
Calm down.
All good.
Calm down. Well, she's sending a shout out to all the
Let me ask a different one. Jane is asking, how do you express yourself when you've got no idea what you want to study? Like, how do colleges look on that when students aren't necessarily picking a major and saying, I'm super interested in this particular thing?
Well, I think it depends a lot on the nature of the institution that you're applying to. You know, if you're applying to a liberal arts college, they're going to celebrate with you that you have an open mind and that you're looking forward to exploring broadly within the curriculum. You're not going to mind the distribution requirements, you know, because you're looking forward to studying the humanities and the social sciences and maybe math and science and the physical sciences. If you know what if you are very directed in terms of the major you want and the career path that you're on, a lot of colleges will either measure you against that track, or they will say to themselves, okay, if she's not successful in that, what's she going to do? So they want to make sure that their curriculum is going to be big enough to embrace you as you change your mind, because the expectation pretty much is that everyone is going to change their mind for the good. You know, you may do a circle around back to the original academic interest where you say, I've got a major in this and this is my professional goal. But it's different if you're applying to a liberal arts college versus applying to a university where you're kind of on the fast track for a professional path. colleges hope that you will change your minds over and over again once you're in college and you have broader exposure to many fields of study that you haven't perhaps had a chance to experience yet in high school. But some kids are way down the line in terms of research they've done and high-level classes that they've taken, and they're splitting atoms in their basement for recreation, and that. When a student has a very strong focus and a lot of coursework and maybe even internship experiences to support that, that can be a very appealing applicant for especially a research university. But liberal arts programs are really looking for students who are ready to come in and have strong interests and passions, but that are really going to embrace the whole curriculum. And often they have requirements that make you embrace the whole curriculum. We can't over-specialize.
We'll do a couple more because we're almost at time. Let's see, maybe we'll do one or two more. Here's one. This is, I know it differs, but this is kind of like a behind the scenes question. How many people, I misread the question. I read how many people read your essay after you send it, but this is specific to essay writing. So I won't look at that one because I promised we wouldn't talk too much about essays here. I want to get your take on some of these other things. Let's see. What's your take on interviews? How does an interview approach students, like, in terms of students preparing for interviews? What is that something, by the way, and this is a super leading question, is that something students need to be worrying about right now? When it comes time, I'll just show my hand. It's interviews, you don't need to worry that for a while, but what advice do you give to students when it comes to preparing for an interview, say?
The first thing I would say is if an interview is offered, take it. Because if a college cares enough to make interviews available, whether they are on campus with a member of the admissions staff, or they're with alumni interviewers who are trained to interview all around the world, or a Zoom interview, if it's offered, the college is saying that it values it. So they're saying there's something that we learn about you face-to-face that adds a dimension to your application that is valuable to us. It's also an important expression of interest. And if the college weighs demonstrated interest in their admission process, then taking advantage of things that are offered like that can be profoundly influential, all things being equal, among applicants. What was this?
That's great. No, that's beautiful. And also, by the way, for the person who asked that, there's a little guide for that.
Yeah, there's a guide for that.
Susan, as we wrap here, what do you want students and families to know as they kind of head into this year that in some ways is going to be filled with still more uncertainty, certainly for colleges, but certainly for families? Like, what message do you want them? What do you want them to take away from this?
As they're looking ahead to being an applicant?
Yeah. For juniors who are getting ready to go through this process, what do you want them to know?
Well, colleges want to get to know you. They truly, truly see the admissions process as their effort to invite you to think about being a student there on that campus. So the more information that, whether it's, you as a student taking virtual tours, sitting in on virtual classes, if you're able to visit a campus, if that's feasible, doing that, showing that you as a high school student are going into a research process that is deeply evaluative of them and of your fit with them in terms of how will your interests and needs be nurtured, be met by that institution. Whether you're able to get feet on the ground on the campus or not, a lot of kids can and a lot of young people can't. But they can research and engage in a research process with a college that shows a great deal of well-placed values, that they're looking for a fit that will allow their very best to come out when they're a student at that college and allow that college to really know them in the application process. I think that's very, very important.
Absolutely. Amen. Well, thank you. I'm so grateful always to talk to you and to know you, and grateful to Sadie for joining us for the session. It was totally fine. And thanks, friends. So stay tuned. We're going to follow up with the resources. We are coming your way with some new webinars coming up probably in the next couple of weeks. You'll get an email about that. And then for all of you who have all of your essay questions, don't worry, you're going to get them all answered. We've got sessions and sessions for days coming up. So thanks, y'all, and we wish you a blessed and a healthy and peaceful rest of your evening and rest of your week. Be well.